2021-024. We're going to pull that back. We've got some corrections to make, and then it'll be brought back for a future agenda.
Any objection to Mr. Brown's request? Seeing none, that item is pulled. We'll come back later. Any other changes to the agenda, Mr. Hale?
I'd like to pull resolution 21-019, please.
21-019 is pulled. Anything else on the consent agenda? Seeing none, the agenda is approved as presented with 21-019 pulled. Pledge of Allegiance. Mr. Barkley, would you please lead us in the pledge?
I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Thank you. Senator McKee is here now with us in attendance. For the record, he's 602 or 601. There are no preceding minutes, meeting minutes, reports from the cities. Does City of Wasilla wish to report? Hi, George. Welcome, Madam Mayor.
Good evening, Mr. Mayor, Borough Manager, and Assembly members. I'm Glenda Ledford, Mayor for the City of Wasilla. The CARES Act Phase 5 PPE application process ends on March 19th. And we have Skate the Lake Community Skating Party, and it's Saturday, March 20th at the Wasilla Lake, Newcomb Park, noon to 1:30 p.m. Hot cocoa and cookies will be provided. Bring your skates, your kids, your family, and enjoy. And it's time to sign up for summer fun, because it will come. The adult summer slow pitch softball leagues are now taking registrations. And you can find more information at matsusoftball.com or call 376-9050. Does anyone have any questions?
Questions for Wasilla? Looks like you're okay. Thank you.
I have a question I'd like to ask either you or Mr. Brown. The ALI system, the 911 address system, when was it last updated, or do we update it once a year or whatever? Because we've had a lot of people moving in.
Mr. Manager, I'll let you have this.
I will follow up with you on that. I don't know the specifics. I do know there are regular updates, but I don't know the last time it was updated off the top of my head. So
Okay,
I'll
thank you,
follow
sir.
up with you tomorrow.
Thank you.
I'll watch him. Okay. Palmer, nobody from Palmer, Houston School District. We got a joint assembly school board meeting next week. State of Alaska, Mr. Smolin.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor, Manager Brown, members of the Assembly and staff, Todd Smolden, Matsu Office of the Governor. I just wanted to give you a update on vaccines first. You might have guessed this, but the Matsu is lagging behind the rest of the state in vaccines per capita in terms of getting them into the arms of people. And in fact, at the state level, I think this week, we were predicting that we might have more vaccines available than people who had signed up. So I reached out to the Matsu Health Foundation today. I don't know if they are planning on doing an ad campaign similar to what they did with the mayors and managers earlier in COVID when it came to masking and social distancing, but that's a possibility. Certainly we're asking everyone who can to do some outreach, and vaccines, I think part of the problem as we've discussed it is that there was communication about, shortages of vaccines and things like that. And so there could just be a lot of people who don't want to take somebody else's vaccine and they want to wait until there are enough available, but there are certainly enough available. So make sure you're looking out for people who might need help getting registered or get somewhere to do that if they want to do that. The other thing I wanted to just report on a little bit is, as you know, the federal stimulus package passed. And so I'm sure you're well aware of the monies that are coming to you and what you might be able to do with those. You're having those conversations already. And so there is some good news in terms of money coming, regardless of how you feel about whether or not, that was a good decision or not. There will be money coming to the state and to local governments. So a lot of it will be, at least at the state level, will be to add to programs that already exist. So some of the PPP stuff, the business grants, things like that. But more information will be coming out about that as time goes on and we start to make some more decisions at the state level. I don't know if you have any questions for me, but I can take them if you do.
Ms. Nowers?
I have a question, but thank you for coming and everybody's getting a $1,400 check pretty soon. I just, if we can buy local, and I don't know if the state can do anything to reinforce, like, you're getting that check, let's spend it here locally.
I couldn't agree with you more. And also we're approaching tourism season and we continue to message that at the state level that Alaska is a safe place to travel to. And so I think we should be encouraging people to come up here as well, who we might know outside, to come up and enjoy Alaska. So good point.
Mr. Hale?
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. So you said that per capita, or we've got fewer shots in people's arms than other places in the state. Is that, could that be because most of us are getting it in Anchorage, or is it, are you pretty sure that we're actually lagging behind?
I'm trying to figure out a diplomatic way to answer this question, Assemblymember Hale. I think Mat-Su residents have taken a very different approach to COVID than other places in the state. So and most of it, it's not, they do that calculation by residency, not where you get the vaccine. So.
That was really at the core of my question, I guess, yeah.
You know how many have been vaccinated in the Mat-Su?
I don't know Mat-Su numbers. I know the good news is that I was on a call earlier this week and 65 and older were almost at 70% statewide. So, which is great because that's the real vulnerable population. But when you look at 16 on up, we're looking at like around a 20% vaccination rate. So, and that's statewide numbers. I don't have Mat-Su numbers.
So how many of you Assembly members have your shots? Ms. Nowers? Ms. McKee? I can't ask that.
It's a HIPAA violation, Mr. Mayor.
Oh,
No,
I knew that.
kidding.
I just check and make sure the attorney was awake on that.
If they answer willingly,
Okay. How many of you didn't have a shot? Okay, I better go.
All right, thank you.
Let's get out of here.
Have any questions?
Yeah, I know. We appreciate it, Mr. Smolden. Okay, who's next? We got school district. Any other public relations reports? I'll do one. I want to congratulate Dallas CV on his 5th Iditarod champion. Just yesterday morning, I went to see him come in. I actually saw the first 20 teams come in personally. It was quite a deal to see this new route. And the current executive director of the Iditarod and Chaz St. George wanted to make sure I thanked the assembly for the CARES funding because they said they'd never been able to run this race because they had most of these mushers were never in a building 90% of the time. They're always outside just about the whole way. And I talked to mushers. They had COVID tests 7 times, with the nose test, and it was 50 below zero from Iditarod back to Ophir. So a very challenging period of time. But I thought they did a wonderful job to have it. To me, without the CARES funding, they may not have been able to run the Iditarod, which would be like the Yukon Quest. They weren't able to run their 1,000-mile race, and you worry about the future. So they wanted to thank the assembly members for thinking about that. So, and it was enjoyable. We had, just for the record, there was 2 mushers from Willow in the top 5, 4 in the top 10, 6 in the top 20. And then 21st was from my neighbor from Willow. So Willow is mushing crazy. So I want to congratulate everybody. Brent Sauce was third. Aaron Burmeister, an old friend of mine, and his father was superintendent of schools in Nome for many, many years. He was second, won one of his best races. Millie Persold, who's from Willow, so second Iditarod, and she was fifth place this year. I don't think we've ever seen that before. And I think there was 3 women in the top 10 or top 15. I can't quite sure of that. And so it's a very impressive race where men and women get to compete equally and are successful too. So with that, I'll turn this over to Mr. Brown.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. So I'm going to start off tonight. The Matsu Borough received a certificate from the U.S. Census recognizing the borough as an invaluable member of the 2020 Census Community Partnership and Engagement Program. This is an opportunity to recognize some of our staff that put time into that, from our planning department and GIS staff that truly were exceptional. Those staff members include Pam Graham, Carla Goers, Eric Gowdy, Kenny Clewine, Kim Solian, and Carol Reese. So I just want to say thanks to them and their efforts. Obviously, there's a great deal more work to be done as redistricting and reapportionment runs the course once census data has been released. So just thank those folks for their efforts to date. Moving on to the next topic, I'm going to try to see if Mr. Steininger, are you online with us?
Hi, this is Neil. I'm on. Sorry, I was having trouble getting unmuted there for a second.
All right, Neil. We invited Mr. Steininger, who's the director of the Office of Management and Budget for the governor's office. So this came up at the strategic planning meeting. There was a discussion around just getting an update for the assembly on state revenues. So Mr. Steininger agreed to join us tonight to kind of provide a pretty newly released revenue projections and kind of talk through that and allow the assembly the opportunity to ask questions. So Neil, thank you. The floor is yours. I have your slides and we'll advance them for you from here.
Thank you, Mr. Brown. And so the slides really are, I'm not going to go into terrible detail on every one of them, because really the meat and potatoes to talk about is the state's current revenue picture and sort of where we're at in terms of access to resources to support state government. So if you look at slide 2, that's giving you the history of how we got where we are. State had over $16 billion in savings when we started this protracted, near decade period of revenue declines and revenue shortfalls. But coming to more recent history, we've seen some structural changes that have recent update to state revenue that was yesterday, and Department of Revenue has been discussing with the finance committees at the legislature today, brought up our revenue projections by about $460 million from where we were projecting in the fall of last year, and what we used to build our fiscal year 22 budget proposal that we put forward in December. When you look at the third slide here, that's really giving you that picture of that relationship between our current revenue projections and our current proposed spending. So in fiscal year 22, current revenue available, or current projections of revenue available for spending, are about $4.7 billion. So that's $1.7 billion coming from our kind of normal traditional sources of revenue. So that would primarily be petroleum revenue, as well as a little over $3 billion coming from that percent of market draw, or structured draw on state savings. That $1.7 billion number is pretty significant increase from what we had anticipated this to be. And that's really an increase in both price as well as some changes in production of oil and of those petroleum products that we, prior to this revenue crash, had really relied on at the state level. If you look at that comparison to our proposed expenditures for 22, you can see we actually now have a surplus at the bottom line for fiscal year 22. But the big caveat there on that surplus is that's a pre-dividend surplus. So when you factor in the dividend program, you're adding about $2 billion to that number. So really looking at somewhere in the order of a $1.6 to $1.7 billion deficit, net of all state programs. But that's, while that's still a problem there in terms of that structural deficit, it still is good news that we got today. It's definitely, a positive thing to see some rebound in those traditional revenue sources. But when you look at the top half of this section, you can see traditional revenue sources don't really make up the lion's share of the state's revenue anymore. We're really now more reliant on that percent of market value draw, that structured draw from state savings that gives us that stability that really helps planning purposes for state budget. The fourth slide on my presentation here really is looking at those state savings accounts. The constitutional budget reserve is what we've used over the last decade to balance the books for the state. That's how we've been able to manage through that $16 billion that we had saved away. Now is being spent down to about $1 billion, $1.3 billion at the end of 22 with these new revenue estimates, so a little better than we had expected. But really, that's not at the level of budget that the state has and the structural deficit that we're looking at. That's not really enough money to continue to rely on. So the CBR, for our purposes, is not really a source of money that we know we can continue to go to keep kind of kicking that structural problem down the road. The permanent fund earnings reserve, these numbers, I'll note, are based on the official projections made by the Permanent Fund Corporation. They make their official projections annually and don't make adjustments based on mid-year performance, but they've been having a really good year. So these projections on that earnings reserve balance are very conservative and very low compared to what earnings to date this fiscal year have been. But still, that said, it's a balance that we don't really want to look at as a well to go to solve problems. Really, this is the available portion of that nest egg for the state for the future, the permanent fund. So when we look at that as a state savings account, we really don't like to think of it as a savings account we should go to for ongoing operating costs. It's kind of an account of last resort, if you will. Going to slide 5, I'm not going to go into detail on every one of these, but it gives you kind of a picture of where the main spending for the state is and what's kind of consuming this revenue that the state is bringing in. You can see that it's, a couple of large chunks make up the lion's share of state expenditures. But with that kind of brief overview, I'm happy to take any questions anybody has about whether it's, the recent developments in state revenue or the various proposals that we have to fix some of these structural problems with the state.
Questions? Ms. Norris? Who is Mr. Hale?
Thank you, Mr. Steininger. Through the mayor, on that slide 3, if you could flash back to that. You have expenditures statewide operations. There's quite a difference between the FY 2021 total and the FY 2022 total. Is CARES Act funding included in this? What's the difference between the 1.9 and the 775?
And that's a great question. And yes, it is CARES Act is what's really driving up those fiscal year 21 numbers. So if you note at that bottom line, the 11.7 billion down to 10.5 billion at the final budget number, really that in fiscal year 21 is all CARES Act money coming in from the federal government and being distributed. So this chart hasn't been updated for what we're calling ARP, I think the American Recovery Plan, that money that's coming into the state. So in future updates, as we get a better handle on that money, you'll see that 22 total funds number spike again, to show that additional money coming into the state.
Okay, thank you. You anticipated one of my follow-up questions. I have one more question, if I may. So I know the percent of market value draw from the permanent fund, they were looking at about a 5% amount for a sustainable draw to allow the permanent fund to continue to grow and and help pay things. The figure I've heard for what we're looking at with a PFD payment is about an 8% draw. Is that a figure that you're in agreement with?
That sounds about right in terms of what that percent draw would be for including the fiscal year 22 dividend. And we do those percents off of a trailing average. So the 5% ends up, because it's on a trailing average, ends up working out to in the 4.5% of the real value in a given year. But like you said, that 5% is targeted to allow continued growth in the fund. And be sustainable over time. But that additional draw in fiscal year 22, really we're proposing as a 1-year action, really not a sustainable long-term solution to that problem. And that's why one of the constitutional amendments that we put forward is very important, is it allows for the kind of locking up of that earnings reserve into the corpus of the permanent fund and prevents any sustained excess draws on the fund. And that, over time will help ensure that value going forward and kind of ensure that rigor to that 5% draw.
Thank you. And I guess my only other thing, I don't know if you have any comment on it, is it did look like the permanent fund had a spectacular year on the market, but the projections for the next going forward 10 years were for expected much lower returns in the 6.5% range instead of, I think for the past 5 or 10 years, we've been over 10% every year. But thank you very much for the presentation.
Any other questions?
Yeah.
No, go ahead, sir.
I was just going to note the 6.25% earnings estimates that they use. They're trying to balance, that long-term projection of, you have some of these high years like this year, but you might have years like subsequent to the 2008 market crisis. You have those years of really low earnings that sort of balance it out, and that 6.25, 6.5 is what they think of as the longer term projection and look forward.
Okay. Manager Brown? Any other questions or?
All right. Thank you, Neil. We appreciate your time this evening we do have another question. Sorry.
Yeah. Through the mayor, how much money is swept into the CBR each year and then reversed? So I think they do that every year, right? The money's supposed to be swept, all expended funds are swept into the CBR, and then they do a reverse sweep. Do you know how much that is?
Yes, so that is in the order of $1.4 to $1.8 billion roughly each in the last year. And each year. And so that's a constitutional provision that so long as we have a debt to the CBR, so long as we haven't repaid any of that borrowing we've done over the last decade, the Constitution directs that those funds go into the CBR to pay off that debt. However, each year the legislature then appropriates that money back into the funds from which it came. And really the purpose there and the reason that reversal of the sweep is important is because there's a lot of state programs that rely on those funds that otherwise would have to be funded through unrestricted general fund appropriations. And so the impacts to direct service delivery of, non-reversal of that sweep would be pretty significant in terms of, what individual Alaskans that receive some of those services would experience. So that's why there's that policy decision every year by the legislature to reverse the impacts of that sweep.
But that appropriation is not reflected in these expenditure figures. Is that correct?
That's correct. So when we put these figures together, since we've included language to reverse the impact of that sweep, it's our presumption that it that it'll be passed and enacted as it has been, every year in the past. Some years a little bit later than others, but our anticipation is that it will be passed.
Okay, this is the mayor speaking. How much money is the state going to receive from the federal government in this new round of legislation that just passed and signed by President Biden?
So we're still getting a handle on every pot of money that's coming in through that legislation. There is the one largest pot is a little over $1 billion, and that is very similar to what was called the CRF, the Coronavirus Relief Fund from the CARES Act. That's the portion that we did the municipal distributions through. So it's about $1 billion with another couple $100 million that's directly going to communities rather than it all coming through the state with the distribution being made at the state level. We also have a couple other pots of money, a couple of smaller groups in Department of Transportation, a fairly significant amount of money in the order of $300 million or so going through Department of Education that's part of those education distributions that have happened in prior COVID relief bills, and then a handful of smaller grants here and there that we're still getting a handle on exactly where they're coming in and what the dollar values are.
Is the money for like the Matsu Borough coming through the state to the borough or directly federal to the borough?
That's a great question that we're actually trying to figure out the answer to right now. The way the legislation is written at the federal level, to our eyes, looks like it will go directly to the community. However, there's a chance that that federal treasury reaches out to us to have us facilitate those transfers. So kind of remains to be seen the exact mechanics of how that money makes it to the borough, whether it will be a similar agreement with Department of Commerce, the Community and Regional Affairs Division there, like happened with the CARES Act money, or if it'll come straight from the Treasury to the borough.
And what's the timeline on this new money? Is it, it was pretty restrictive last year in the CARES funding. We had to have it done by December 31st. Is there any timelines on this?
Mm-hmm. So the timeline on this one is through the end of calendar year 2024. So a much longer time period for use of the funds than the CARES Act had. So I think that's a bit of a benefit here that allows a little bit more long-term thinking in the use of the money. Whereas the CARES Act really, as you mentioned, it was initially only through December of last year, and that sort of changed the way that you would use the money, but this provides a lot more long-term thinking in its use.
Okay, Ms. Nowers?
Thank you, through the mayor. Mr. Steininger, do you have any more information on the infrastructure funds coming to the state and what they could be used for? I heard it was in the neighborhood of 100 million or so through the CARES, the latest rescue plan.
Yes, that's a great question. So it's, the way that it's worded is it's about $100 or $110 million in something called capital money. So there's a couple of areas that the guidance seems to indicate that it should go towards, and that's education, healthcare, and kind of other remote infrastructure type projects. And, we're still trying to understand exactly what they mean by those different categories to get a better idea of how those dollars will be allocated and what types of projects we want to direct them to. And we do have some meetings coming up here with folks at the federal level to get a better understanding of that and ask some of those questions we've had as we're trying to interpret the use for the money.
Thank you.
Any other questions for the director? Mr. Manager?
All right, thanks, Neil. We appreciate, again, your time for dialing in this evening and giving us an update on this and sharing your information. So thank you, and I guess we'll let you release you, I guess, from the meeting a little bit early, so appreciate your time again.
I want to thank you personally, Mr. Saniger, for speaking to us and talking about this. How many lawyers do you think we need to hire to figure out how to use this new money?
Too many to count.
Okay. I was hoping it would be a little easier than the last round, but thank you. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you, Mayor Halter. Thank you, Manager Brown. Thank you for the invitation to speak tonight.
Okay, appreciate that. Mr. Manager, anything?
Yeah, so the next update under the manager's comments tonight will be on the West Susitna access. We're just going to provide a quick update for you. I'm going to ask Brad Swartz from Public Works to come forward. He's going to give you a little bit of background and talk a little bit about the timeline in general. Then our representatives or folks from ADA are also in the audience to provide some updates to you and allow you the opportunity to ask some questions. With that said, I'll turn it over to Brad.
Good evening, Mayor and Borough Manager and Borough Assembly. My name is Brad Swartz. I work in the Public Works Department as the manager of the Pre-Design and Engineering Division. I came here tonight to provide you a little bit of background information on the project before we get our update from the ADA staff. In 2019, the borough entered into a non-binding MOA with ADA to begin exploring the possibility of developing access to the West Susitna area. The ADA board then approved phase 1 ground truthing, and they completed that report in January of 2020. In June of 2020, the Assembly then approved entering into a second MOA with ADA to carry out phase 2, which would involve providing public input support, gathering engineering, wetland, and other data. One of the benefits the borough is going to receive if this project is developed is access to the Fish Creek Natural Resource Management Unit that contains potential for agriculture, forestry products, commercial use, public recreation, and settlement. And just on a side note, I'm a little bit of a history buff, so I thought I'd let you in on this. The route being studied has quite a history that spans 123 years. The United States Geological Survey was the first government entity to study the route in 1898. More expeditions by the U.S. Army and USGS were sent to bring back route and area details in 1899, 1902, 1911, and in the same year, in 1911, the Alaska Road Commission began the work of opening up a winter trail, which went up the Susitna, along the Yentna, up the Squentna, and over Rainy Pass. That route became a regular, steady route to the Kuskokwim area for many years, and still is part of the historic Iditarod Trail. In 1926, another major expedition was launched by USGS via boat and overland into the Squentna region, mapping the topography and geology. And then in 1961, the USGS mapped out a possible road corridor paralleling the Yentna and Squentna rivers, followed up by a DOT study in 2013, which is studying the same area as we are. As far as project timeline, we're in the early feasibility stages and we'll continue to gather data if you all approve the phase 3 study, which will be following this one, and that will take us into 2022. At that point, the decision will be made as to whether or not the project is feasible, and we'll go into development with design and so forth. The borough's role in this project right now is partnering with ADA in public involvement and also reviewing the consultant delivery products such as the engineering reports and wetland studies and so forth. And with that, I'd like to introduce Jesse Peterson from ADA, who's going to give you a project update.
Thank you, Brad, and thank you, Mayor Halter, Manager Brown, and Assembly. Today, just wanted to formally present the conclusion of phase 2 studies that we had presented on back in June. We concluded the final product first week of March, and we accomplished all of our objectives. We were able to accomplish the field wetland mapping. We also produced a preliminary report, which I think you guys have in front of you today, which kind of goes through at a high level, kind of talks about some of the characteristics of the road, some of the engineering highlights there, and also gives an opinion of probable cost. Some of the deliverables that we produced in this study that are available on our website, we produced that preliminary engineering report. I believe you guys also have a communications plan in front of you. We produced a wetland mapping report. And also there was, we held a virtual open house in early December to give an update and give the public an opportunity to comment on the project. And one of the things I'd like to highlight today is that this is our fifth opportunity for public engagement. Our first was in June when we presented on the MOU for phase 2. The second was we had the open house in December. This will be the third. And Brad and I have also presented to the Matsu Fish and Wildlife Commission 2 times. And I think we're actually presenting and updating on Thursday as well. So that's, while we can always be better, that's certainly a highlight for this phase. A couple of the highlights of the road. It's about 100 miles starting from Ashire Road and going out to Whiskey Bravo. We've categorized 156 stream crossings. Of those 156 stream crossings, we've identified that 145 will get culverts, of which the 145, 90 as of right now will be designed for fish passage. And also we've identified 11 bridges. And out of the 11 bridges, 4 of them are considered pretty complex, fairly major structures. We came up with an opinion of probable cost of $350 million for this 100-mile road. And it's important to note at this early stage that there's a pretty healthy contingency on that amount. And as we refine the engineering and refine the project and step through the phases, those numbers will likely come down. So to kind of touch base on the future scope development, we're working with Matsu Borough leadership right now to develop the scope of phase 3. And we're going to work through that process here for the next couple months, really identify what should be included, and make sure that we check all the boxes for the borough and for Ada, and look to have something in front of you guys in the next 6 to 8 weeks, probably towards the end of spring, first part of summer, for a formal presentation on the MOU for phase 3. So with that concludes the update for West Susitna, and more than happy to take any questions. We have our executive director for Ada is here, and he can help participate as well.
Okay.
So,
Questions? Ms. Bovee?
Thank you. So I'm getting a lot of questions from the Northern District as far as the ice road going from Willow to out to the mining area. I was just curious if that's in any way related to this project or just a coincidence that they built a very impressive and busy ice road.
I'm not aware of any ice road related to this project.
Thank you.
Ms. Nowers, go ahead.
Thank you. The Mayor, reading phase 2, I kind of was under the impression that there was going to be sort of a, ballpark is this project economically feasible? But can you just kind of walk me through, I mean, you have a cost estimate, but when are you kind of looking at or at some point, are you looking through a kind of cost benefit analysis? And could you just walk me through when you would actually make that determination?
Yeah, so this next phase is really going to be everything that we need to do to get this to a point where we could potentially submit for Army Corps of Engineers permit. through the federal government. And so this next phase will be significantly more robust, and we'll be able to kind of build on the work that we've done to date and really refine some of the data that we've collected. And another pretty significant component that we didn't pick up in phase 2 that we're going to propose in phase 3 is going to be the cultural and historical resource analysis that has to be done. And that's a pretty important thing to understand, because there's the potential that we might have to reroute the road to miss some significant archaeological sites. And so we'll have a better handle on those costs, and with the refinement of the engineering and a little bit better understanding of the impacts, we should be able to come up with a better answer and really address that, if this road is going to be economically viable or not.
I just have a couple follow-up questions. So the road, who's going to maintain that? Who do you foresee maintaining it?
Well, that's something we haven't fully vetted yet. It kind of depends on the users and what kind of agreements we have in place. But I think there's an opportunity there that it might not have to be maintained all winter long. I kind of envision something like the Denali Highway, to where it's not plowed in the winter. I mean, these are just some options that are available, but we haven't advanced the project to that type of discussion yet.
Do you have a sense of if the borough would be responsible for the maintenance, or would the state take care of that?
That would be, certainly up for discussion. We don't have that level of detail to analyze that yet.
Okay.
On that.
Yeah, thank you. And, I guess my questions might be a little pointed, but I look at this from a very selfish Mat-Su point of view. Is this an asset or liability to the Mat-Su? So knowing what all the costs might be to Mat-Su and all the potential revenues. And, if you could get back to us at some point on what you think the revenues are. I know we've mentioned agriculture and timber. I know timber just has not been a revenue maker for us recently. So just any projections you have on what revenue, you're telling us about 350 million in costs, and then some amount of maintenance cost. My other question was just on the port. I know this would connect to the port, but do you foresee from the mining areas, or do you expect them to ship their stuff out a different route, and primarily the port would be an import, bringing materials in?
There's certainly the potential for the port to be an export port. There's the resources in the West-Susitna Basin that could certainly utilize that. This next phase is going to involve kind of a high-level feasibility of what we can expect to go through the port if some of this access is built. And so we'll have a better understanding of the condition of the port, and what type of improvements or upgrades, if there's anything that would need to be required to accommodate potential bulk export and import of equipment and machinery and whatnot.
And particularly, I was interested in any mining materials that you saw would go out of the port, or would you expect that to be, are you talking more about bulk commodities like timber and ag products mainly?
Yeah, it's, there's several different mines and types of mines out there. You think of through the bulk export commodities out there, you've got timber, certainly agriculture could be a pretty significant component of that. And it's pretty attractive. And there's the gold mines, and those mines have, there's other opportunities. There's copper concentrate. And so we've got a fairly good handle on what's out there, and we just got to understand kind of the timeline for the investment, and really understand if the port is set up to kind of handle that. So.
And then just last two things, just the public process. Did you say you're planning to have another open house? I know it was frustrating for people that last time around that it was virtual and they couldn't see who else was online. I thought there was talk about trying to do sort of a follow-up, but is there plans for a follow-up?
So this is kind of concluding the phase two. So we're complete. This is the formal completion of that. So what we're working on right now is a phase three, and which will be a much more robust program for the West Susitna. And within that, we've certainly heard the feedback that there would like to be more public engagement with this process. And so we're going to work to make sure that we have a better system in place for having more open conversations. Now that some of the COVID is kind of getting mitigated, there'll be the opportunity to have more in-person type meetings. The virtual open house went well and was received well, and I think that worked good. But there's really no substitute for in-person meeting and discussion. So we'll look to make sure that we have more updates in the future. And with phase three being a little bit larger, it warrants having more updates as well.
Yeah, that would be great. It seemed like people have concerns, and seeing those kind of laid out as well, what the major concerns were and how you could address them would be super helpful. And then the other thing that would just maybe a request instead, in addition to kind of revenue costs, is a map that shows us the route with land ownership. If that's something Ada could get back to us with, that overlays the route on state, private, borough land, because I haven't been able to find one yet. And if you've got something like that or could provide something like that to the assembly, that would be helpful.
Yeah, so actually we do have something like that. It's posted on our website. And so we've got, essentially we've got the road laid out on 11 by 17 drawings that are, I think, stationed about every 5 miles, and it's overlaid with a Google map, and you can kind of see the terrain, and I believe the property boundaries are there as well. And so we really made an effort to avoid private property and actually stay within the existing right-of-ways that are out there. And so we've done a pretty good job of doing that. So that is available right now on our website.
Yeah, it's possible to provide me the link to that. I wasn't able to find that. So just
Sure.
looking for that. That'd be great.
Absolutely.
Thank you.
Others? So this 100-mile road, you say $350 million.
Yes.
And how's that being funded? Exactly.
Alan, would you like to help address some of that?
And you're saying the cost might be lower?
Yeah.
I've never seen that before, but on a road.
Hello, Mayor, Assembly. It's good to see you again.
Yeah.
This is Alan Weissner. I'm the Executive Director for ADA. To answer your question, we're approaching the project the same way that we're approaching the Ambler Access Project, where we're looking to do it on a private-public partnership basis. So right now, all the early phase, and this is really, Jesse, correct me if I'm wrong, a 5% design?
Yeah.
More or less cost? I really do want to emphasize it's a very early preliminary cost that we're talking about. And we do believe there's going to be contraction on the amount of cost per mile for the road project. But the ultimate funding is going to be raised by ADA and ultimately in bringing in private capital to fund the project. And if I could address an earlier question that was raised, was on the Assemblyman Nowers, I believe he had the question on the maintenance for the project. That also similarly would be approached as the Ambler Access Project, where ADA would be owner operator of the road. This is a multi-use public access road, but it's really for industrial access on the economic development for the resources and connecting with Port McKenzie. So the maintenance, really what we're looking at is through that operation and the revenues that we're able to generate from the road, addressing the cost of capital that we're raising to fund the project, and then its cost of operations. So we would not be looking at the Matsu Borough in supporting the road. We'd not be looking at the state in supporting the road. We'd be looking at really the underlying revenues supporting the economic development, resource access, and volume use along the road, as well as be able to provide the additional public access, right, that we're talking about with the assembly for certain elements, right, of the road project.
So the initial cost, you say less than 350 million, but we'll just use 350 million. That's going to be private money with ADA money, which is state money?
It's going to be the cost of the project, we're talking construction, which is the cost of $350 million, not the development capital that ultimately gets us to construction. But for the construction itself, we're looking at raising it the same way they were approaching the Ambler Access project. Ultimately, with ADA funds partnering with private capital based upon the revenues that are generated from the road itself.
And those revenues are coming from?
They would be coming from all the resource owners that have access to the road. And from that, it's enabling the access to a broader area. We're not looking at one individual mine access. We're looking to a district access. The boroughs resources would be included in that. The agricultural development that could come from that access. It's all of that and the volumes that would be using the road support the underlying road and its cost.
And your timeline?
That's a very interesting question because right now we're in pre-feasibility. So we're looking to establish the information that gets us to the point that we're able to submit the permitting that we require for the road. And that takes interaction with the assembly, that takes interaction with the underlying private users, it takes interaction with ADA and its board. So in order to get to that point, what Jesse's highlighted is we're looking at phase 3 that we want to propose ultimately to the assembly. Once we have the information fully together, propose it as well to ADA's board, that would take us to February or the, say, spring of 2022 to make a decision, be able to make a decision on whether an application would be submitted for our NEPA permit, which would be required for this road. And that would be done in concert with information provided to the assembly.
Well, you know, we've got a railroad spur project that sounded a lot like this, you know, and it's not funded, it's not finished. It's, you know, I'm just wondering why would it not be better to finish that railroad spur line and ADA help the borough and the railroad finish that railroad spur line and get that project that's already half funded, $180 million into it, need another $120 million. Why wouldn't that be better for everybody?
I can't directly answer that, Mayor Halter, because I don't really know the underlying situation or the history that was behind why a decision was made on that rail link. But what I can identify for you is that in any investment that's being done with private sector capital, with ADA capital, we're looking at ultimately the revenues from that project paying for the underlying capital itself. So the question would ultimately come to, for an investment to be done for the rail link, ultimately to Port McKenzie, is understanding what is the use that's on that rail that would support it. With the access we're talking about with the road itself, we're talking about engaging and getting access to a mining district that has other resources that would then be brought to Port McKenzie. If you're looking at that development and then you're looking at what other alternative sources could be for more volume coming to Port McKenzie, that may support some type of additional rail link. And that has been addressed with other mining interests that are throughout the state. What I would highlight, Mayor Halter, is really look at the fact that these access projects that we're talking about, that ADA is looking at pursuing, like the Ambler Access Project, like the West Susitna Project, is looking to diversify Alaska's economy to be able to look at and generate more volume to where its existing infrastructure, the state's existing infrastructure, can have higher utilization and broader utilization. So if we're able to pursue and we're successful in the further development of the Ambler Access Project, if with your support, we're able to pursue the West Susitna Access Project, there we're talking about volumes that enhance existing infrastructure, utilize that port facility. We have been talking about with phase 3 doing a analysis of Port McKenzie that supports its broader utilization and really trying to make sure that any investment that's being done in Port McKenzie it leads to a much more broader, full utilization of its capacity.
Well, I appreciate that, but, and I look at this, you got 145 culverts. I do appreciate the fact like 90 of them are fish culverts, we're hitting that right on the button there. 11 bridges, 4 complex bridges. Then you've got crossing the Big Sioux. There's only one bridge I'm interested in, and that's Port McKenzie across the Connect Arm Bridge. I mean, to me, that is the future of the Mat-Su Borough. And I appreciate this and all this, but we got an
funded railroad spur line that was started and not finished. And now all of a sudden we're going to start this 100 miles. And I'm just not sure, I'm convinced that it's going to produce what you're saying it's going to produce. The cost of the money up front plus the private partnerships, I just have trouble with that, especially with these projects that are not finished. And so I'm not speaking for the assembly. This is just the old mayor talking.
Well, I think any types of these projects that we're talking about, it benefits from skepticism, right? Because it asks the right questions about what's being produced, what ultimately is the true effect of any capital that's being raised. And the state, across the board, needs to be very specific and pointed on where we're applying our capital. And that's one of the things that with this initiation of the project, what we've tried to do at every stage has been working with the private sector as our partner and with the Matsu Borough as our partner. It's not that, and I don't want to represent that ADA is making independent decisions at any point in time on this. We're really working in a public-private partnership on how it comes together. And each one of those components needs to be there to answer your very specific questions on that.
Connect Arm Bridge. Ms. Nowers?
Thank you. I got a, just on the financing of the road. Well, two questions. One, the private capital, are you planning that with the mining companies, there would be agreement if they put private capital in, are they likely to get some kind of royalty or tax credit offset from the state for their contribution? Would that be part of the package? And then as far as financing the road, I got a little confused with where the revenues would be coming from. Are you saying the royalty or taxes those companies would pay that would go to the state and then the state would use those funds? I just kind of lost the thread of where that money would come from and how it would pay for the road maintenance.
Sure. Let me first address your first question about the contribution of their capital, right, for the development of the road. As an example, again, reference the Ambler Access Project. We have a joint venture agreement with Ambler Metals for the final feasibility permitting that's left on that road development. We've estimated that to be about $70 million for a 210.6 mile road. And the half of that is going to be contributed by Ambler Metals in a funding agreement that they have with us. So in the development agreement, which is a public document, I would highlight, and is on our website, the agreement itself highlights that for the 35 million, again, assuming it goes up to 35 million, that they contribute, they will obtain a credit at some point in time on their usage fees for the future road. And what I would highlight there is that under that arrangement, if for whatever reason we're not able to get to completion of the road, again, it's final feasibility and development, then they don't, their 35 million is still invested in that development. It really only comes, or the value that they get from it is from the future use that they would have as an offset to the full toll that they would have for their volumes on the road itself. And I'm envisioning that there would be the same process that we're talking about with the West-Susitna Access Road for the higher industrial users of the road, the ones that are supporting its ultimate development. It may well be too that we have direct investment with some of these parties as an owner in the road. That is an option that's on the table. It's not what we're currently doing with the Ambler Access Project, but it is a potential option with West-Susitna, and other roads like this have been developed that way in the lower 48 for industrial use. So it really depends on what the return requirements are from those parties that are contributing the capital. Right now, on this initial phase, again, pre-feasibility, before we really get into this final feasibility element, there's no agreement on that. It is we're each working together to advance the studies to get it to a point in time that there's a fully supported road, issues addressed on the environmental side, to where we're able to make an application to the federal entities that need to review the environmental permitting. And then at that point in time, decide really what the capital is necessary to go forward and develop the road.
So are you, just to clarify, are you talking about a toll road here that everybody would pay for? Is that where the usage fees would come from?
We're modeling on the same way that we developed the Long Mountain Transportation System, which was supporting the Red Dog Mine in the Northwest Arctic Borough. The Ambler Access Project, the same. It's going to be based upon usage fees of the major volume users of the road. Again, it addresses your question on maintenance. If you're the major user of it, you're the one that's creating the need for the continued maintenance ultimately of the road. So that needs to be embedded into the price, the toll of the use charges that would be for the road itself. Then you did have the second question on the financing, right, and how that would be raised.
Oh, just, yeah, that, you know, if they're contributing, are they gonna see offsets? So, so if
Yeah.
Nova Gold contributes to it 10 million, and then if there's a usage fee on that road, they might receive a credit to not have to pay that usage fee?
It depends upon the initial, the initial parties that sponsor the development for the road and the initial financing for it are the ones that receive that type of benefit. Any other, once the road is established or the access is established and it's been responsibly developed, then additional users coming on are going to be looking at the full, usage fees that are there. They don't get the initial advantage of working with us and the Matsu Borough and ultimately the initial cost and development of the road.
Thank you for clarifying.
Mr. Hale?
Thank you, through the mayor. Thank you for coming. So we're talking about private partnerships and usage fees and things of that nature. Are those partners going to be able to control access to the road? For instance, will there be like a guard check like you have up on the north slope where you have to have a badge to get through? Or will any resident of the borough or resident of Alaska or tourist or whatever be able to drive up that road? What's that plan look like specifically?
Well, through the mayor, that's how we would address it with the Matsu Borough Assembly. And that's ultimately what I would highlight as part of the elements of the public part of the public-private partnership. It's the accountability that's attached with it from the public administration of the road. And the involvement on that side is why we've engaged early on the Matsu Borough to be our partner with this. If it was an industrial-only access road, then we would certainly be approaching it and controlling it that way, because its principal use is industrial use only. But in this case, what has come from the comments from the Assembly is the need for have public access. And so that's why it's so important in having the Assembly involved and Matsu Borough staff involved with us in this early stage of how we're addressing the development of the road, and would be ultimately looking at what type of permitting we're going for, is by determining what the requirements are going to be from the public aspect of the Matsu Borough, the user, right? The borough itself that benefits from the road. So in determining that, we're determining the accountability elements from the public oversight of it. We establish the private requirements with the industrial users, and we administer ultimately the road based on those requirements on a ongoing basis. We're talking about infrastructure that exists in the state, hopefully for the next 50 longer years. So it's really ultimately under your requirements, what can be administered with those private users, and to ultimately coming to the agreement with them, and which benefits you and benefits them, the true partnership side of the public-private aspect.
Anything else? Well, I think you're lucky, because this is my last term. I'll be done in November. And I hope you don't think I'm a skeptic, but when I came on my first assembly meeting, this is 2 terms of assembly, 2 terms as mayor, I got the Susitna, an $89 million boat, a free boat that turned into be one of the biggest jokes on earth. And then the railroad spur line came, and this was going to solve all the borough's problems. And look at, it's still not finished. So I just want to say it again, Knik Arm Bridge. That's what we need help with from ADA, or the railroad spur line, or both. And then you could go jotting across the Big Sioux out in that wilderness. That's how I think.
Mayor Halter, we need those continued comments, because your point is ultimately, promises can't be made unless they're delivered on. The way that we talk about it internally is that if ADA is getting involved in a project, there needs to be tangible benefits to Alaskans. Job growth, economic development, but tangible. We're not looking at ultimately creating new studies that get filed
I'll get
On
you
top of
200,
other
I get you
studies.
200 dog mushers that'll be able to haul your stuff out and back efficiently.
Well, then maybe that's another
And
way of
then in
looking
the
at it.
summer, you could barge stuff up the Big Sioux, then up the Yentna, and then you could build a shorter road. Okay? Any other questions? I shouldn't be. I'm just burned out with these projects that don't seem like they really benefit the Mat-Su Borough. And I mean, I love the fact that it could happen, but it doesn't seem like it happens with these projects. That's so you're lucky. I'm gone in November, and I'll be a happy camper down in Mexico someplace, but I appreciate the time.
Mayor, I honestly believe that the state benefits by having access to its abundant natural resources. But we need to do that responsibly, and we need to do it on terms that work with the local community.
And we don't want any of these at-grade crossings for the Diderot Trail. We want underpasses and we want it safe, okay?
Okay.
Okay.
Thank
I hope you
very
get your
much.
project, but just get rid of me.
Thank you very much, sir.
Okay.
Mr. Mayor, I believe that's all we had under manager's comments tonight. I do want to thank Mr. Weitzner, Mr. Peterson, as well as Mr. Swartz for coming forward and providing this information. I think it's helpful just to continue that engagement. So gentlemen, I appreciate your time this evening. That's all I have, Mr. Mayor.
Okay, let's see, Mr. Spropoulos, Legal World.
Thank you. No, that's okay. Oh, there we go. Mayor, members of the Assembly, I'm going to talk again a little bit about the Alaska Constitution and Article 10, local government tonight. So remember, these are the ones we've gone through already: purpose and construction, local government powers, boroughs, the assembly, service areas, and the unorganized boroughs. So the next part of the Constitution talks about cities. Remember back when we talked about local government powers, said that the state may delegate taxing powers to organized boroughs and cities only. Well, last time we talked about boroughs, tonight we have cities. And again, prescribed by law is how they're incorporated. That just basically means the legislature can set up how a city forms, and they are part of the borough in which they are located. So cities outside the borough, outside of the Matanuska-Susitna borough, or outside of any borough are part of the unorganized borough. And of course, our cities, Palmer, Wasilla, Houston, are part of our borough. Again, their functions are set either by the legislature or their charter. And just like a borough, they can be merged, consolidated, classified, or reclassified, or dissolved as prescribed by the legislature. That's what that means when it says in a manner provided by law. That means the legislature gets to set the rules. So rules for the cities are a lot like the rules for the borough. And why do we call it a city council? Well, that's because the Constitution says so. Governing body of the city shall be the city council. I don't have a whole lot to say about that. What I really want to talk about tonight is charters. So some states allow charters for municipalities, some states do not. Alaska does. And so if you see in the Constitution, the qualified voters of a first-class city or first-class borough may adopt, amend, or repeal a home rule charter. So we'll talk about it a little bit more. As prescribed by law, well, the legislature did act, so the next part doesn't really matter too much these days in Alaska. It says that local governing bodies have to prescribe rules if the legislature doesn't. But the next part, when we talk about charters, is every charter or part of charter has to be submitted to qualified voters and approved. And so when we talk about the charters, the Constitution allows the first-class boroughs or a first-class city to then kind of increase in powers and increase in local government control by adopting a charter. Charter must be approved by the voters. And when you look at a charter, it actually relates back to the beginning of the constitutional provision on local government because it is maximum local self-government. It defines the organization, its powers, the functions. Charters actually come from the Middle Ages in Europe, and it was a privilege granted to a township to hold a fair, store goods, do things. People who lived in a chartered township answered directly to the king and weren't serfs. So if you're into medieval history. Again, adoption and all amendments must be made and ratified by the voters. And so a charter, as I explained to people who've asked from time to time, is almost like a mini constitution. It says what your local government can do. And so you hear a lot of times in Anchorage when they talk about voting initiatives and ballot propositions and charter amendments, right? There was a bunch of years ago, there was a charter amendment that said if no mayoral candidate won more than 40% of the vote, it had to go to a runoff. There was a different charter amendment that said all debt had to be approved by a 60% voter margin. And so then thereafter, there was another voter question for debt put on that had with it a charter exception that said, oh, by the way, we're putting this before you, and we're creating an exception to the charter that requires the 50%, the 60% rule to pass this with only 50%. So while the rules say that all charters and amendments have to go in front of voters, they are flexible, subject to the will of the voters. Just like the Alaska Constitution is flexible, subject to the will of the voters. It has to get there. And so the charter really defines what a city or a municipality or a borough can do. The next section of their constitution says that the legislature may extend home rule to other boroughs and cities, because remember, it starts with first-class boroughs or first-class cities. Now, at the time of the Constitution, what was a first-class borough or city? I'm not really sure because the statutes weren't written yet. However, our Alaska Constitution gives a lot of flexibility to the legislature to say, look, you may delegate or allow other boroughs and cities to have home rule. And the legislature, in fact, did. Any borough can go home rule. So you don't have to be a first-class borough to then become home rule. You can be a second-class borough and go home rule. Cities, you still have to be a first-class city. So second-class cities would not be able to. And then what does it mean to be home rule? So that's kind of the culmination of these three articles in our Alaska Constitution. It means a borough or city may exercise any legislative power not prohibited by law, that means by state law or federal law, or by its own charter. So if the charter prohibits something or doesn't allow for something, a home rule municipality would not be able to do it. And for us, we're a general law municipality. So Title 29 governs in large part the borough's powers and duties. And in Title 29, there's actually a list, and it says only these parts of Title 29 apply to home rule municipalities, and it lists 67 subsections. So there's probably several hundred subsections of Title 29, and unless they're prohibited by law from doing it, home rule, plan and land use regulation, some of those issues there, some of the stuff with doing local improvement districts, LIDs, which we have state law that we have to follow, home rule municipalities would not. Those are just some examples of things that the legislature has said you don't have to. And so when you talk about a home rule jurisdiction and the fact that in Alaska we can have a charter, it really means that the legislature has to affirmatively take power away, not grant power. And so earlier this year or last year when we were talking about mask mandates, we were talking about the different municipalities and the boroughs, first-class borough, home rule borough, first-class city, second-class city. They all have, to some degree or another, powers not prohibited by law. It's only second-class boroughs that don't have that. We have a list of powers. Well, home rule charter kind of flips that on its head. The legislature would have to have a list of powers that it actually took away under home rule. And so we have very strong constitutional provisions about home rule charters. And as I said at the beginning, certain states don't allow for home rule municipalities. That's it for tonight. Till next time.
That's it. Very good. I enjoy those. What's our next topic from?
We have a couple more constitutional provisions to go through, and then we're going to talk about the formation of this borough.
The early days.
Yeah.
Okay. Let's see, Madam Clerk.
The clerk's report is in your red folder.
Okay, thank you. Are there any comments on the citizen and other correspondence? There's 7 items there being presented to the assembly. Everybody has read them and studied? Ms. Nowers, have you read all these and studied all these? You have? Good for you. I won't ask anybody else. That's good enough. Hearing none, these are presented. There are no informational memorandums. There's no person to be heard. There are no public hearings. I think, is this the first? Pretty.
It's green.
Okay, we're at audience participation, so this is your opportunity to speak to the assembly on any topic. If you're on the phone and would like to speak to under audience participation, please hit *3. You will hear your hand has been raised. Everybody wishing to speak under audience participation has 3 minutes. So do we have a sign-up list? No sign-up list. Do we have a telephonic? One telephonic. So go ahead, who's ever on the telephone.
Hello there. My name is Steve Perrins II. I'm out here at Rainy Pass Lodge right now. Last name is spelled Perrins. Sorry I couldn't be there in person. We just got Iditarod fishing up coming through our lodge here. But wanted to share some thoughts with you on the Susitna Road project, as that would be very detrimental to our way of life and business out here if that road is built. It will absolutely shut us down. As Alaska's oldest hunting lodge, if road access is put out into this area, then like other road access areas, eventually the game will be put on a drawing system, and it's basically impossible for a guide to operate, not knowing if he draws one permit or two or none that year. So we have very detrimental concerns about this. I've been working with my parents here for 19 years and just looking to buy this lodge with my wife and kids and take it over. So I've got a couple comments to share too. I appreciate that that they did the open house back in December. That was the first public outreach that we heard about. But I would really urge that there's more direct outreach to the stakeholders. There's still a lot of people that are unaware of this project. All the businesses, fishing guides, hunting guides, private cabins in the area, Fish and Game Department should weigh in on their thoughts on the project. And there's many people that still do not know what's going on with this. I believe it's important for the assembly to hear what its constituents thinks about this as well. As far as the public-private partnership, I agree strongly with the mayor. The Knick Bridge and the spur line are definitely more important projects that should be worked on. When I worked back in the legislature, I was working on that Knick Bridge PPP, and I think that would be a lot more beneficial to the Mat-Su Borough, and open up land and area that could be developed closer to town there. When you look at the revenue sources that they talk about out here, geothermal and wind, I'm not sure how much revenue that brings in. I guess we could look at Fire Island and see how much revenue we're getting from that wind project. I'm not familiar with the agriculture, but I'm sure Mat-Su has a good handle on how much income is coming in from that. I've never heard of oil out in this area, but the natural gas I hear is just right across the inlet, not 100 miles inland. And as far as the timber goes, seems like it's all beetle kill now in the Mat-Su Borough. And when you get out here, we have a 8-inch diameter black spruce that took 75 years to grow that big. So that doesn't really seem like a good timber harvest for revenue. It seems like the main thing is where the road goes to is a mining camp that's 9 miles from us. And it's actually just an exploration camp, not a mining camp. And the road goes straight from there to the road system. So that's where the majority of the revenue will come from what I can see. And it seems like they'll help build the road, but the public part, there's still going to be taxpayer dollars that pay for it. And once the road is built, then the mining company will have a credit and not have to pay for it. So there'll be more tax dollars that pay for it. And then as soon as they're done harvesting, they'll be gone, and the public will be left paying for the bill and maintaining that 100-mile road in the long run. So I'd be happy to answer any questions or discuss it further, but it's something that we're watching closely, and I would like to believe there would be a way to operate their mine without destroying our business and way of life out here after 84 years in existence. So I'd strongly encourage other ideas and ways to get that done. So thank you for your time and for listening.
Okay, thank you. And Dallas Seavey told me that he had a pretty good time with the horses up in your area.
Yeah, that's right. We had a heck of a time with that. You know, usually the Iditarod comes through and we can keep them corralled for the 2 days, but this time when they were coming back through, the hay was already on the lake and there was no stopping the horses. We did corral repairs. We flew an electric fence and had all sorts of things going, had hay stored in other buildings, and the horses just walked right through that fence, and we'd chase them off, drag hay off, and there was just no stopping them once they found it. So
the rule is straw, not hay next year. Okay. Thank you very much for calling in. Any other telephonics?
Yep.
More telephonics? Okay, next caller, please.
My name is Margaret Stern, Stern. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, we can. Go ahead, please.
All right. I too am calling in regards to the West Sioux Mining Access Road. I don't think that this project should move forward to phase 3. Listening to the ADA representatives as well as the Public Works representative really illustrated that the project is not ready to move forward. Bob said that one of the main goals of phase 2 was public input. Jesse says that all objectives of phase 2 were accomplished. And if public input was truly a goal, then all of phase 2's objectives were certainly not accomplished. Public outreach has been very poor at best, and for a large-scale project, it will irreversibly alter the character of the borough, while also asking for borough support. Residents of the borough should have a say and not be left in the dark. If you mention the road to people of the Mat-Su borough, a paltry percentage would know what on earth you were talking about. And if you speak to people off the road system living in the area in question, many know very little about the road or are frustrated by the lack of transparency and inability to comment. Listening to the transcript of the last open house, people are very upset about the public outreach education and comment deserve much more investigation. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Any more telephonic? Next telephonic caller, please.
Good evening. This is Melissa Hoyer with the Susitna River Coalition. I am calling in with just brief comments tonight, as we sent in written comments earlier, as well as the transcript of the open house communication. I just want to reiterate how inappropriate I think that the public record that ADA and HDR put forward about that open house and how that information was shared with the public went, and that there was zero follow-up with any of those questions that were brought up during that open house. If this is the way that public comment and public participation is expected to continue in the future, I hope that the borough steps in to correct that if phase 3 is entered into. I also want to add that we have been listening to ADA's presentations in Juneau for their ADA presentation and the bond hearing package, and that the information they're presenting there is very different than the information they're presenting to you, the Assembly. They've been presenting this as a very fast-tracked project with a lot of public support. Their information online says they're going to start building this project in 2025. And they are asking for public funding to do that. I want to reiterate Mayor Halter's comments that the history of ADA and the Mat-Su is atrocious, and they have a series of bad and unfinished projects, including the failed Kinnick Crossing, Point McKenzie, the dead-end rail spur, and the Susitna Ferry. And I would just be very hesitant about going into any further agreements with this organization, considering what their track record is in the borough and how they've handled this project so far. I would like to ask that if anything is gone into, that you request a more detailed open house project. The virtual open house, I think, actually worked pretty well for the public, considering the geographic spread of the people who would be impacted by this road. I think a virtual option is actually pretty beneficial to most folks since they wouldn't be able to attend in person. But the follow-up, the actual impact of this testimony on the project, and just reaching out to participants and people who would be impacted by this road, I would ask the borough, make sure that there's better participation in the future. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you. Just for the caller's information, you certainly, Ada had nothing to do with the ferry and you know, we'd asked for their support on the railroad, but basically that wasn't their fault because it's not finished at this time. Any other callers? Anybody else in the audience wish to speak? Haverin, are you up?
My name is Eugene Carl Haberman. I live in the Matsu Valley, follow the public process. When the public process is done appropriately, a decision made by the governing body is more likely in the public interest. On your agenda tonight, you have RS 21-019, and Assembly Member Hale had pulled it. That was a wise decision, but you need to do more than that. You need to do a motion to postpone it definitely, because what you got here is not sufficient information to be making decisions on the item before you, dealing with the wastewater treatment plant stuff and how the borough is handling it. Also, note the one line in that, what was said was failure to get a public-private partnership. They didn't have anyone from the private sector come in. And that's not surprising because the past history of the borough has invited parties dealing with port projects and so forth, and they've gone sour badly, and look at the port today. So kill this whole thing, bring out those contracts, also bring about the cost. The borough has already been involved in this issue of dealing with sewer treatment plants and so forth. That's not shown here. It should be a detailed audit accounting and how far it goes back, because where we are is, it looks like we're going back to zero again, back into the beginning, and bringing another party and asking the city of Palmer to be invited. But note the city of Palmer has already had a bad record with the federal government legally, and they're under problems with their past history and dealing with court issues. So you're bringing in another party like Palmer at this time, and remind you, your former borough manager is now the city manager in Palmer. So that's not going to be a pretty picture of transparency, openness, and poor record history of the parties involved. Also, I like to say this, dealing with COVID, you got a sign outside, masks are required in the borough facilities. Unfortunately, many take their masks off. The mayor, mostly the entire meeting, borough mayor specifically, doesn't have a mask on there. I guess you don't want to comply, and the borough manager takes it off when he's speaking. But in an Anchorage Assembly meeting, they comply. And I can hear them clearly, and the public can hear the people clearly when they're speaking. You want your faces in picture books? Well, don't do it on the account of dealing with the COVID issue. Keep the mask on. And to the city mayor of Wasilla, mask, it says here, mask for the nose too. And then pretty much the entire meeting doesn't cover the nose. That's frequently happened. And Fred Myers and Palmer now, I'm seeing 10% of the people walking into the public, into the Fred Myers in Palmer wearing masks. That's all. That's how bad it is. So we're not going to get over with the situation until you deal with it appropriately and show respect. Thank you.
Okay, anyone else wish to speak to the assembly? Mr. Sykes, come forward, please. Is that how you're going to talk about all that stuff you got on that page?
Oh, I've got 8 pages here.
Okay, you're excused.
Mr. Mayor, members of the Assembly, my name is Jim Sykes, and I came here to talk dirty with you. Septage, in fact. I want to speak in support of RS 21-19. The bottom line here is 85% of the people who live in this borough that go to the toilet and take a shower are on septic tanks. 85%, it's about 90,000 people. This latest round of solving the problem began in 2008. The 6 years I spent on the Assembly, I think that I was about the only member of the Assembly that paid any attention to the Wastewater and Septic Advisory Board, but they did a lot of good work. The municipality of Anchorage has a waiver from the EPA to discharge what they call, quote, primary plus wastewater into Cook Inlet. It's not much above raw sewage, but it's better. And when this process started in 2008, we decided we needed to solve the problem ourselves because eventually it's going to be up to us. We don't know exactly when, but in 2015, they said, yep, we're going to close you down. That's in 2015. Just a month ago, they sent a letter that said, well, it's going to be open. It'll be interesting to find out how long that's going to last after the election in April, but we actually have to solve the problem because it's a public health and water quality issue. And I'm glad to hear that the borough is interested in working with the city of Palmer to actually do something. I support the feasibility study, but one thing I would like to have you add is a preliminary engineering report, because whether the city of Palmer or the borough or both go forward, you can't even apply to the USDA, which has already been approved by this Assembly a year or two ago, to apply to the USDA. The split is about 70-30. And you will have the opportunity to get low interest rate financing, because with all the federal money that's about to hit, your interest rates are going to go skyrocketing. So it'll probably pay for itself. But I think you should have that preliminary engineering report as part of the feasibility study. You might do it in stages, but I think it's something you need to do. So I guess what the main message is, we don't know what the future is going to be with the municipality of Anchorage or the EPA, but we're going to end up dealing with our own septage in one way or another. While we're not obligated to, it is an overreaching issue. So you have a chance to just put an amendment in both the title of the resolution and the second, therefore be it resolved. And that would be simply to say that the, just add and preliminary engineering report after feasibility study would solve the problem. And if you want to talk about costs or any of my vast experience with the WASOB, I'll be happy to answer any of your questions.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, and good luck. If you solve this, you will be historic.
This one was pulled, so we'll have further discussions. Anybody else wish to testify to the Assembly? Any telephonics? Okay, we'll close out audience participation at this time. We are at the consent agenda. We have pulled item 21019. So Madam Clerk, would you please do the rest of the remainder?
Resolution 21-024, a resolution approving an amended scope of work for project number 15035 for Fund 480 Point McKenzie Community Council Grant. AM 21-020, amending the scope of work and budget for contract 19-061P with NV5 Geospatial, formerly Quantum Spatial, to supplement funding for an acquisition of aerial image for 401 square miles surrounding the core Palmer, Wasilla, and Houston populated areas. AM 21-021, accepting the late filed and retroactive senior center and disabled veterans exemption application. AM 21-022, award of bid number 21-105B to Stepper Construction Incorporated in the contract amount of $178,509.10 for Julie Marie and Morgan Circle improvements. AM 21-024, award of bid number 21-1 37B to Valley General Construction LLC in the contract amount of $251,837 for Holland Avenue improvements.
Assemblywoman Bovee.
I move to approve the consent agenda as read into the record by the clerk.
Mr. Sumner.
I was just curious. I thought we'd pulled 2 items. I thought the manager requested something be pulled.
Well, that was off the introduction.
Oh, okay. Sorry. Yep.
So that was taken care of right off the bat. Okay, any objection to the items read by Madam Clerk on the consent agenda? Mr. Yan, any objections?
No, sir.
Okay, hearing none. That portion of the consent agenda is approved. And now, Madam Clerk, Resolution 21019.
Resolution 21-019, a resolution endorsing a septic treatment facility feasibility study to include evaluation of the City of Palmer's wastewater treatment plant for septic disposal and suspending application for construction funding of a septic treatment facility until the feasibility study is complete and the Assembly decides to proceed.
Okay, who pulled this? Oh, Mr. Hale, go ahead. You got to move it and then go ahead and discuss.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. I move to adopt Resolution 21-019. And I pulled it just basically so we could maybe get a staff report, just talk about it a little bit.
Mr. Dolan?
Let us know what's going on.
Terry Dolan, Director of Public Works. We brought this legislation to you tonight because there's been 2 significant changes since we last came before the Assembly. The first one was mentioned earlier, that Anchorage Water and Wastewater Utility, rather than saying they were going to stop receiving our waste, has said they welcome it, that they like having the revenue associated with our waste because it helps them spread out the cost of their capital improvements. So that's a 180-degree turn from what we told the Assembly last time we brought a document like this to you. And the other thing that has changed is that the City of Palmer, with the upgrades to their wastewater treatment plant, is in a position now where they have excess capacity, and it may be feasible to use that plant for septic treatment. So with those 2 major changes, it seemed prudent to revisit the issue with the Assembly on the direction that we wanted to take. I think in front of the Assembly, there's really 2 major questions. The first one is, do we want the borough to provide septic treatment as a service to our residents, number 1? And if the answer to that is yes, then this offers a way forward to examine what that would take technically and what it would cost. If the answer is no, then the Assembly could turn this off and we could stop working on the issue.
So just a question through the mayor. What is the staff's opinion of including a preliminary engineering report at this time? Is this an appropriate time to do that, or is there something else you're waiting on? Or, I think the speaker made a good point about the money is pretty low interest right now. I just wanted to get your take on that.
Yeah, I think at this point, it would be too early to spend money on an additional preliminary engineering report. And the reason why is because the results of this examination will put the Assembly in a position to make a prudent decision on whether or not it wants to move forward. Specifically, we need to analyze whether or not we can be competitive with Anchorage Wastewater Utility. You heard earlier tonight from Mr. Sykes that of this waiver, this EPA waiver that they have, it allows them to treat waste in a very inexpensive manner. We will not be able to obtain that kind of waiver, so our costs are expected to be higher here, even using an existing plant. And so we don't know with any kind of certainty whether or not we could do this at a rate that's competitive with Anchorage. So I think you need to know the answer to that before you start spending money on a preliminary engineering report.
So say we do our feasibility study here, and then we get to the point where we think, well, maybe we can do this, then that would be the time for the preliminary engineering report. Do you think we would be able to get Palmer City to buy into that to help fund that preliminary engineering report? Would that be in their interests, or is that kind of something that we might approach them about, or how does that work exactly?
So it's very difficult for me to predict what the city will do. I think that the analysis that's proposed in front of you there will help not only you, but also the city determine whether or not it wants to participate in these activities. I think the city certainly could benefit from the use of their excess capacity to generate revenue to help pay back the costs of the plant. So I think there's a potential benefit for them. Whether we could convince them to participate in the cost of future studies is a tough question for me.
Mr. Two? So, Mayor to Terry, so if the borough puts in money for Palmer to increase their septic system, does the city of Palmer then turn back and pay back the borough for the money that they invested into that?
Through the mayor, we do not have any kind of a financial agreement with the city of Palmer on this project at this point. So any funds that we would invest in analyzing this would be solely on the borough.
Mr. Sumner?
Thank you. Oops, did Mr.
So through the mayor, I guess if I'm getting this right, the feasibility study is mostly to look into the economics of the project, because, I mean, it's Palmer System, so they would know if they could receive that waste already, right?
So through the mayor,
I would think anyway.
So through the mayor, the plant in general terms has the capability to treat domestic wastewater. But there are some things about septage, especially our septage here, that are unique and are not, were not considered in the design of the Palmer wastewater treatment plant. So what we're examining here really are two things. One is the financial feasibility of it, as you described, or the economics involved. And two is the technical requirements. So just for example, the Palmer wastewater treatment plant doesn't have a dump station where you could dump septic tankers. That's something that would have to be added. And we would have to examine the capacity of the system to deal with the waste. Septic waste doesn't necessarily come in a continuous flow like sewer water does. In Alaska, lots of people get their tanks pumped when it's dividend time because they have extra cash available. Just for example, does that happen?
I don't see a appropriate, would staff be coming back then with an appropriation for this feasibility study, or is this like a blank check that we're asking for? What would the cost be?
So we don't know exactly what the cost would be of the study, but, and I was actually asked that by a couple of assembly members earlier in the day. I sat down and spoke with Mr. Kraft about the issue. I mean, the process typically is we would put out a request for bids or a request for proposals, and then receive those back, potentially pick the best qualified firm to do the work, and then negotiate the price from there. The price that you pay on these kinds of things depends entirely on the amount of detail that you want and the number of man hours that go into the work. But you could structure it just about any way that you want. Typically in the past, this type of analysis has cost us around $20,000 to $25,000. But we could structure it higher or lower than that if we thought it was useful to do that. Costs at that level typically don't come back to the assembly. I think we come back to the assembly at around the $100,000 mark. But this is just asking for guidance in terms of how we spend funds that the assembly has already approved us borrowing.
So, how many trucks a day are?
May I ask a question after Mr. Hill?
Yes, Mr. Yant, we can do that. How many trucks a day are going to go to Palmer if this were to come about?
So,
what's the volume going to go there?
The volume is in the range of 12 million gallons a year to 14 million gallons, somewhere in that range. And of course, how many trucks that is exactly depends on the size of them and then the time of year and the, like I said, in PFD timeframe, you're going to see more. What I had envisioned and talked to the city manager about for Palmer was that we would place a dump station in a industrial area of the city. If you know the area where Public Works is, or MEA, MTA, there's a lot of industrial activity over in that part of town, and there's no residences over there. And that would be the kind of area you would want to choose because it's on the city sewer system, but there aren't a lot of residences to disturb over there. So if you have odors associated with the dump station, for example, you're not going to bother anybody if you're in the industrial part of town, whereas if we put it in a residential area, it would be a problem.
Okay, who was next?
Beyond, I think.
Toby, were you up?
Mr. Hale was.
We'll go with you, Mr. Yant, and if Mr. Hale wants to follow up, he can.
Okay, thank you, sir. So I had a great visit with Archie Giddings from the city of Wasilla today. He's been on the advisory board for 7 years, and I really learned a lot. I'm grateful for his help with that today. One thing I forgot to ask him that Mr. Dolan will probably be able to answer is, would we be able to take our leachate there as well, or would it just be the septic?
So I think it's unlikely we'll be able to treat leachate in the Palmer plant. And the reason why, and I think I mentioned this in our strategic plan briefing, is that leachate is a industrial wastewater, and the treatment requirements for industrial waste and the testing requirements associated with the effluent are significantly higher and more costly than domestic wastewater. So the city now is treating domestic wastewater through its sewer system, and septage is also domestic wastewater, so septage wouldn't change those. It would be possible probably to modify the plant to accept industrial wastewater, but that would be very costly, far more than what we're talking about here.
Okay, and then the other question I have, which it kind of builds off of what Jesse had asked with the blank check thing, and thank you for clarifying and at least an estimate on what it would cost for the feasibility study. But I believe we can use our CARES grant money for this moving forward. I know that was something Mr. Brown and I talked about today that we're not exactly sure yet. We're waiting on Nick to advise on how we can use this next batch of money, but there's potential there. I did want to add that there is potential to use the CARES grant money for stuff like this. So, me personally, I think back on that last earthquake that we had, and when you talk about 1 million gallons a month headed south, there was only a few days that those roads were shut down. But man, we could really put ourselves in a pickle. I know most of these private contractors that are hauling it in don't have a lot of storage available at their locations. And a lot of the septics, unfortunately, they're not all pumped at dividend time. That is when most people do it, but a lot of times they're pumped on an emergency basis. And so, someone's sewer backed up or something, and you got to work on it, and they can't do that when the tank's full, and so on and so forth. So, I think it's a good thing that we keep moving forward with this. I also want to add that I would much rather see the city of Palmer benefit from the revenue of 12 to 14 million gallons a year rather than the city of Anchorage. With that being said, only if it makes sense in a free market, type of setting. So right now, the reason they're able to treat so affordably in Anchorage is because the body of water that they dump it into is the second largest tidal, in the whole world, right? That body of water is the second most powerful body of water in the world. So it basically cleanses itself, right? So I know they do have to treat to a substantially higher level in Palmer, which costs more. With that being said, when those trucks aren't on the road for that extra 40 minutes each way, so an hour and 20 minutes per trip, I think it may bring the price back down to where it makes sense. And so I'm all for the feasibility study myself. The engineering report, I think we should wait to see the results of the feasibility before we spend money on that. It just may not make sense, right? So that's all I got. Thank you.
The second sentence, Mr. Dolan, and suspending application for construction funding of a septic treatment facility until feasibility study is complete. Is that really necessary in there?
So the reason we put that line in there is because the Assembly previously directed us to seek the USDA grant, and that study is a component of application for the grant. So at this point, I have that line in there because I don't think it's prudent to spend the money when you don't know whether this is actually feasible or not yet. So that's why we're suspending that portion of the analysis, or recommending that the Assembly do that.
Wouldn't it just automatically be delayed until your feasibility was completed, or?
No, that's not the case. We actually have money available now that Assembly approved us taking a loan out, I think to the neighborhood of $20 million from the Alaska Clean Water Fund. It's 1.5% money, I believe. And so we have sufficient funding available to move this forward right now. The reason we were potentially considering a USDA grant is that a portion of the cost could be grant money, like 30%, which obviously would reduce our costs in paying it back. So I think there's some benefit if we decide to build this thing. There's some benefit in seeking a USDA grant, but we've sought those grants in the past and were unsuccessful in obtaining them. So there's no guarantee that that study will produce any revenue for us at all. Nor is there necessarily a need for it. We have the funding right now.
Anything else from Assembly members? Ms. Nowers?
I guess I'm kind of torn on this, not super excited about a bunch of trucks coming through Palmer. And also just looking at the bottom line, you know, if Anchorage just did a big investment in their system, they're going to want to pay that back. That seems like the impetus behind switching from where they were to where they are now. If we don't send our septage there, then they've lost a bunch of income. We're still sending our leachate there. I assume they're going to want to pick up the costs potentially somewhere in there to all their users. So I just wonder if we're going to end up, you know, paying somewhere there. I'm not sure. The whole point of this would be to save money for people who have septic systems in the valley. And I guess I just don't know if we have studied that question enough. I know we have studied this before. You know, do we have enough information to know the answer to that right now? Or do you feel like things have changed enough that it's worth taking a look at the feasibility? I just, you know, how much money do you spend studying something? We've studied it before. Anyways, do we have enough to kind of know that answer now? Or do you feel like there's elements that have changed that we might want to take a look at there?
Through the mayor, you're correct that we've examined the costs associated with this in the past, but those analyses were all predicated on us constructing a new plant somewhere in the borough. They never took into consideration the possibility that we could use an existing plant, and we never really had an opportunity to do that until Palmer upgraded their facilities. So I think the conditions have changed substantially since the most recent analysis of this, and it's worth examining it again if the Assembly wants to move forward with this. Clearly, there's no obligation or requirement for the Assembly to move this forward. We are not the owners of the septic waste. It's owned by the public, and the disposal of it is the responsibility of the public, and typically through an agreement with their haulers. That doesn't involve the borough government at all, that relationship. It certainly could if the Assembly wants to provide that service, but there isn't an obligation or an urgent need to do it at this point, which is exactly why we're back here today talking about it.
Where in Palmer are they going to deliver these loads of septage?
The concept of that hasn't really been developed. As I mentioned, what I told Mr. Musi was I thought in one of the industrial areas of the city it would make more sense, potentially over by the Public Works building, for example, in an area that's all industrial over there. I don't know if you know that portion of town.
Yeah, I know it pretty well. Where is the current wastewater treatment plant for Palmer?
So if you, trying to think how to describe it, it's if you go out of Palmer towards the Springer system and past those Springer loops down towards the river, you'll find it down there. I can't name the road for you, but it's not far from the river, and it's outside the city limits out past the Springer Loops.
So you're probably gonna have to route these trucks past Miss Nowers' house and on her road, right?
No, I don't think so. And the reason why is because the city owns an underground sewer system that carries the waste already.
Okay.
It's just a matter of metering the flow into it at a capacity that the system can handle.
I was just giving her a hard time, so. Okay, Mr. Brown.
So, Mr. Mayor, just to be clear, we talked about this during the strategic planning special meeting a few weeks ago. And the reason that we brought the resolution without all the cost data and all that is this is a pretty significant change in direction from what previous assemblies have provided public works and capital projects in terms of a direction for a septic and wastewater treatment facility. So we wanted to make sure we had support and direction from the assembly that was clear. And I think to Mr. Dolan's point about stopping the spending of money is we've been investing in studies and plans to develop a septic and leachate facility at the central landfill. So to Ms. Nauer's point about traffic and whatnot, those concerns are still going to exist if we can continue on the current track that we're on. It's just going to be in a different spot relative to Palmer. It's still in District 2. And I think ultimately to Mr. Dolan's point, is if we're going to get into the septic business, because right now the reality is the borough's not in the middle of that. Private haulers haul that to Anchorage. AWU takes care of that. The borough's not really in the middle of that. If we were to get into the middle of that, I think the question is, do we want 2 plants in the valley or do we want 3 plants? And if we see an opportunity to leverage existing infrastructure, it's probably going to benefit us from a cost perspective in the long term to utilize a facility that's already there, kind of gain from the economy of scale, partner with the city of Palmer, potentially, if it's feasible, as a way forward, as opposed to continuing down this road of building a septic facility at the landfill. So that's essentially what we talked about at that special meeting. Now we've put into a resolution so that we have clear direction from the assembly about the direction you want us to go in with regards to this item.
Any more questions for Mr. Dolan?
May I add something?
Yeah, go ahead, please.
I wanted to mention that, and I just thought about it, is I asked Archie Giddings today, who I greatly respect, and he's a very savvy guy when it comes to all this. And again, like I said, he's been on that board for 7 years. I asked if this was something that the Matsu Borough did on its own in the future at the dump there, is it something that we think would make fiscal sense? And he said, in his professional opinion, based on having to build a whole new facility, and then not having, the river right there, it probably would never make sense financially, right? And so, I mean, I don't know if the feasibility study will tell us anything to do with that. The 12 to 14 million gallons a year, I think AWU charges these guys, don't quote me on this, but it's either 1 or 2 cents per gallon that they charge for them to, and I can get that exact number tomorrow, but it's 1 or 2 cents per gallon. I think the private haulers pay to AWU for that. So I don't think it would ever pencil out. It may pencil for Palmer only because they have the solid foundation already in place, right? So I just wanted to add, I don't think it's going to pencil for us to do on our own without partnering with the city of Palmer.
Okay, anything more for Mr. Dolan? Mr. Two?
Not for Dolan, but it's 2.7 cents a gallon.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Dolan, for answering all the questions. And anything further on the resolution 21019? Is there any further debate or any objection to passing 21019? Mr. Yount, any objection to passing 21019?
No, sir.
Okay. Hearing and seeing no objection here in the assembly chambers, and with Mr. Yount's consideration, that resolution passes. Madam Clerk, where are we at here? We got to do no unfinished business, no vetoes, introductions. There we are, caught up.
Introductions for public hearing on April 6th are ordinance 21-013, ordinance 21-022 with accompanying resolution 21-021, ordinance 21-023, and ordinance 21-026.
21024 was the one Mr. Brown pulled? Yeah, okay. Ms. Bovee, could you move those for us?
I move to introduce the legislation as read into the record by the clerk and set the public hearings for April 6, 2021.
Any objection? Hearing no objection, those introductions are made. Let's do the vacancy report, Ms. Bovee.
I move to confirm the mayor's recommendations as follows. Plating Board, resignation of Justin Hatley, Amanda Salmon. Port Commission, resignation of Randall Kowalski. Caswell Lakes RSA number 15, Randall Kowalski. Greater Butte RSA number 26, Carl Copperwood.
Any objection to the vacancy report? Hearing no objection, that vacancy report is approved. There's no other new business, no referrals, there are no reconsiderations, comments. Mr. Spraplus.
This meeting had 6 items on the consent agenda. No comments.
6?
That was it.
Good. Thank you. Mr. Brown?
Nothing, Mr. Mayor.
Madam Clerk?
Nope.
Mr. Sumner? This is going well.
Mr. Mayor, I'd just like to say that I'm encouraged to see that we're no longer going down the route of building our own independent septic facility. I think that if anything is feasible, it would be using Palmer's existing facilities. Although I'm still not convinced that it will pencil out, but I suppose we will see on that. So thank you. And hopefully it's not all running by Assemblymember Howard's house, or she's not downwind.
That's where it's going. That's the road. Ms. Stowers, comments on route heating?
As the crow flies, the plant's not that far away, and if they're coming around the bend from the Parks Highway, it's gonna go past my house. I really appreciated the presentations, the updates on the state budget and West Susitna. That maintenance really concerns me, that maintenance cost on that road. You know, the state right now, they're not lighting the Glen Highway to the south because they're so stretched on O&M. The Parks Highway through Wasilla is just, you know, choose your path through the potholes. They're stretched so thin, and another 100 miles of road to maintain. And if it's going to be paid for by usage fees by mining companies, and they have credits on those usage fees, that money's going to have to come from somewhere. So I really like to see those questions answered as we move forward, as well as the public process. I do think the public deserves a little bit better process in terms of summarizing the concerns that are out there and how they're being addressed, and come back for open house. So I hope that happens, that they get another chance to comment. And COVID, it made it definitely difficult to do that public process. And they did the best they could. I did have one announcement, and this is for Mr. McKee. The Rodeo Alaska is bringing extreme bulls to Palmer at the end of May. These are like the top 40 bulls in the country. So I expect to see you out there asking for a ride on one. But that's really exciting. It's never happened before. So, and then I know at our next meeting, we have a septic coming up again. Mr. Sumner's introduction, and my impression of the history on the domestic wastewater system plan review, that's IM 21-020. My impression was that there was concern with the fourplexes that were going up, as those kind of sprung up years ago in terms of having 4 septic systems on a small lot, and that the assembly prior to me asked for DEC to review them, make sure we didn't have concerns about water quality. And so now it seems, and then DEC said, we're so busy, we can't review them. So now we appear to be saying, well, that's okay. We'll just, do the professional engineer. So I guess I know there was concerns about the possible impact on water quality with those fourplexes, and also what happens if one of the septics fails, where do you go on the property? I guess as part of that, if we could just have a little bit of history whether that's relevant to this for our next meeting when we have a staff report. So just a request to have a little bit of context on that one. Appreciate it.
Okay, thank you. Remind me to tell you about my bull riding report. It's my turn. Ms. McKee, comments?
I would just tell Stephanie that those bulls are pretty expensive beefsteak, by the way. Generally speaking, the top bull on the PBR for the year goes at, if he's sold, goes for $750,000.
Well, it's going to be you and me at this bull riding contest. I want you to know that. So, Mr. Yacht, before I forget, comments?
No, thank you. You guys enjoy your evening.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Two, comments?
I want to say thank you to Ada. Thought that was a great presentation. Sounds exciting that somebody comes up with a project that actually has an end user. And then we also get to use the port to export minerals and whatnot. So thank you.
Mr. Hale?
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. I just answer your question from earlier tonight. I got my second shot today. So looks like here in about 2 weeks, I'm gonna be shaving my face and going out to the bars again. So I'm excited about that. I'd encourage everybody to go ahead and get your shot. I haven't grown a third arm, so go get your shot.
Ms. Bovee?
No comment, Mr. Mayor.
Okay, so I did ride one bull in my life. I think I was a freshman or sophomore in college, and they had a bull riding contest in Vermillion, South Dakota, and they asked for university students to come and ride these yearling bulls. And so we may have drank one or two too many beers, and a couple of us went down there, and they gave me this bull when I was in the gate, and I thought I was good. And they pulled the door, the bull goes out, and I don't go out with him. I just straight down into this. It was bullshit. I mean, just, and it must have been 6 or 7 inches deep. I was so embarrassed. I was the only one that didn't even make it out of the chute. And so that's my bull riding. I never did it again. And so very good meeting tonight. I guess I'm thankful that there's discussions on the wastewater treatment or the septage. It's been a kind of an ongoing discussion ever since I've been around, from planning commission all the way through assembly on the mayor. So I'm glad they're going to take a look at this. And realistically, I suppose I was a little hard on Ada, Mr. Two, but I am serious. That FV Susitna, marine vessel Susitna, then the unfinished railroad spur line, things like this, and I'll guarantee you, the amount of money they're talking about is going to be more than what we're saying to construct this. And across the Big Sioux, they're saying it's a 2,000+ foot bridge. So I'm serious. I'm all in on the Kinnickarn Bridge, because that's going to do more for the borough than any other single thing. And we need to get the railroad spur line done before we do something like this. That's my thinking on this. And so I appreciate the work, but when I look at the number of bridges and the area they're going, I know that country very well. They're going right up to Happy River, where the dog teams just went through the other day. And, I'm hoping there is mining potential there, at some point in time, but I just don't know about the timing of this, until we're ready to finish our railroad spur line and things like that. So enough on that. I guess it'll go way beyond my term in November, probably. So that's that. I just wanted to say what I felt, considering what has gone on in the past with the Mat-Su Borough. We need to shore up our current things with the port, and they're doing that. And I appreciate the manager and all the work from the port people on shoring that up and getting a new marketing plan for the port, getting the railroad spur line done, and then let's look around. That's how I feel about it. So anyway, I guess unless there's anything further, we could adjourn. It's about, what is it, Madam Clerk, 8:11 p.m., 8:12? So we're adjourned at 8:12 p.m.